The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city as James Wilson walked down Fifth Avenue. He checked his watch, 6:15 p.m. His reservation at Bella Vista was for 7, giving him plenty of time to make the 15-minute walk. The breeze felt good against his face after being stuck in meeting rooms all day. James had spent the morning pitching investors on his latest tech innovation and the afternoon working with his foundation team on a new community program. It had been productive but exhausting. Normally, he would have gone home to change into something more formal for a restaurant like Bella Vista, but he was hungry and tired. His dark jeans, navy sweater, and leather jacket would have to do. Maybe I should have called my driver, he thought as he walked past glittering shop windows. But after sitting in boardrooms all day, the fresh air felt too good to pass up. Bella Vista wasn't just any restaurant. It was the talk of the city, boasting 3 Michelin stars and a 6-month waiting list for reservations. James had secured his spot through his assistant weeks ago, but hadn't planned on dining alone. His business partner had canceled last minute due to a family emergency. As he approached the restaurant's gleaming glass doors, James took a deep breath. Even for someone used to high-pressure meetings and major deals, there was something intimidating about these exclusive spaces. He'd grown up in a modest neighborhood, where dining out meant the local diner or his grandmother's, Sunday dinners with the whole family squeezed. Around a table meant for 8. "Good evening," the doorman said, opening the heavy door with a white-gloved hand. The man's smile faltered slightly as he took in James's casual attire, but he recovered quickly, giving a small nod. The restaurant's interior was stunning. Soaring ceilings with crystal chandeliers, tables spaced far apart for privacy, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. A pianist played softly in the corner on a gleaming grand piano. At the hostess stand, a young woman in a tailored black dress glanced up from her tablet. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose a fraction as she took in James's appearance. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" Her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Yes, Wilson, for 7, James replied with a warm smile. The hostess tapped at her screen, her red fingernails clicking against the glass. Her expression shifted from doubt to mild surprise. "Mr. Wilson. For 2? She asked, glancing behind him as if expecting someone else to materialize. "Just me tonight," James replied. "My dinner companion had to cancel." The hostess frowned slightly. "I see. Well, we typically don't seat single diners at our premium tables during peak hours, but—" She looked at her screen again, then forced a smile. "It seems your reservation has a note from management. Please follow me." James followed her through the restaurant, aware of the glances from other diners. Most were dressed in evening wear. Men in suits or tuxedos, women in cocktail dresses and sparkling jewelry. The hostess led him to a small table near the kitchen entrance, despite the restaurant being half empty at this early dinner hour. "Will this be suitable?" she asked, not quite meeting his eyes. James looked around. There were several better tables available, including some by the windows with spectacular views. He considered saying something but decided against it. "This is fine, thank you," he said quietly. The hostess placed a single menu on the table and left without another word. James settled into his chair, placing his phone face down beside his plate. He made it a rule not to take business calls during meals, even when dining alone. An older couple at the next table glanced his way, the woman whispering something to her husband behind her hand. James gave them a friendly nod, which they didn't return before looking away. He was used to this. Despite his success, or perhaps because of it, James often found himself in spaces where people made assumptions based on his appearance. At 42, he had built a technology empire from scratch, starting with a small app he'd coded in his cousin's garage 15 years ago. Now his company employed over 5,000 people worldwide, and his personal wealth was estimated in the billions. But money couldn't buy belonging in every space. James opened the leather-bound menu and began reading through the offerings. The descriptions were elaborate, each dish sounding more complex than the last. Everything was written in a mixture of English, French, and Italian that seemed designed to confuse rather than inform. Ahem. A throat cleared beside him. James looked up to see a waiter standing at his table. The man was tall and thin, with slicked back hair and a crisp black uniform. His name tag read Thomas. "Good evening," James said with a smile. Thomas did not return the smile. Good evening, sir. Can I get you something to drink while you decide? There was the slightest pause before the last word, as if Thomas doubted James's ability to understand the menu. Could you recommend a good red wine? James asked. Thomas's lips tightened slightly. Our wine list begins at $300 per bottle and goes up to several thousand. Perhaps you'd prefer something by the glass? We have a house red for $30. The suggestion was clear. Thomas didn't think James could afford the wine list. Instead of taking offense, James leaned back in his chair. I'd like to see the wine list. Please, he said calmly. Thomas's nostrils flared slightly, but he reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small tablet. He tapped the screen a few times and handed it to James with obvious reluctance. As James scrolled through the extensive collection, he noticed Thomas shifting impatiently. James took his time anyway, finally settling on a bottle he recognized. I'll have the 2015 Chateau Margaux, he said, handing back the tablet. Thomas's eyebrows shot up. The Margaux is $1,200, sir. Yes, I can read the price, James replied evenly. It's a special night. Thomas gave him a skeptical look but nodded stiffly. Very well. I'll bring that right out. Would you like some water while you wait? Sparkling, please. As Thomas walked away, James could see him stop by another waiter and whisper something, both glancing back at his table. The second waiter raised his eyebrows and shook his head slightly. James returned to studying the menu, trying to ignore the knot forming in his stomach. He'd faced discrimination before, in boardrooms, at car dealerships, and high-end stores. He'd learned to handle it with grace and patience, knowing that his success was the best response. But it never stopped stinging. A few minutes later, Thomas returned with a bottle of sparkling water and a single glass. He poured it without a word and left again. James noticed that other tables had bread baskets and small appetizers already set out. His table remained empty except for the water. The restaurant was filling up now, well-dressed couples and groups creating a pleasant hum of conversation and laughter. The maitre d' personally greeted several parties, escorting them to window tables with flourishes and smiles. Thomas returned with the wine, presenting it with far less ceremony than James observed at other tables. He opened it efficiently but didn't offer James the opportunity to taste it first, simply pouring a full glass and setting the bottle down. Have you decided what you'll be having? Thomas asked, his pen poised over his notepad. Not quite yet, James replied. Could you tell me about the chef's specials tonight? Thomas sighed almost imperceptibly. We have a squid ink risotto with gold leaf and ossetra caviar. It's $320. The Wagyu beef with truffle foam and heirloom vegetables is $450. He rattled off the prices in a way James noticed he didn't do for other tables. The risotto sounds good, James said. I'll start with the lobster bisque, then the risotto. Is that all? Thomas asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. For now, yes. Thank you. As Thomas walked away, James took a sip of the excellent wine and gazed around the restaurant. Despite the uncomfortable service, the space was beautiful. The lights of the city twinkled beyond the windows and the soft music created a peaceful atmosphere. He was about to take another sip when he noticed a man at a nearby table staring at him. The man whispered to his companion, then stood up and began walking toward James's table. James straightened, wondering what was coming next. The night was about to take an unexpected turn. The man approaching James's table was middle-aged with salt and pepper hair and a friendly face. For a moment, James tensed, unsure what to expect. I'm sorry to interrupt your dinner, the man said, his voice warm and genuine. But aren't you James Wilson? I saw you speak at the Tech Forward conference last year. James relaxed and smiled. Yes, that's me. I'm glad you enjoyed the talk. Enjoyed it? It changed how we structured our entire startup. The man extended his hand. I'm Richard Chen. Your advice about focusing on community impact alongside profit margins helped us secure our second round of funding. James shook Richard's hand, pleasantly surprised. That's wonderful to hear. How's the startup doing now? Growing steadily. We just hired our 20th employee last month. Richard beamed with pride. I won't take up more of your evening, but I just wanted to say thank you. I appreciate that, Richard. It's always nice to hear that those talks actually help people. As Richard returned to his table, James noticed Thomas watching the exchange with a slightly confused expression. The waiter approached with James's lobster bisque, setting it down with noticeably more care than he had shown earlier. That's kind of you to say, James replied, taking a sip of his espresso. Reynolds leaned in slightly. I've been hoping to discuss some potential collaborations between your tech ventures and our hospitality group. We're looking to revolutionize the dining experience through technology, mobile ordering, personalized recommendations based on dining history, that sort of thing. James nodded politely. Interesting concepts. Perhaps we could set up a proper meeting next week. I'd love to show you some of our other properties as well. Reynolds was speaking quickly, the words tumbling out with barely concealed eagerness. The restaurant group is expanding rapidly. We've got 3 new locations opening next quarter alone. I'd be happy to have that conversation, James said, keeping his tone measured. My team is always looking for innovative partnerships. Reynolds beamed. Excellent. I'll have my assistant contact yours tomorrow. He took a sip of his scotch, then set it down carefully. Now, I hope everything has been satisfactory with your dining experience tonight. The service up to our usual standards? There it was, the opening James had been waiting for. He glanced over at Thomas, who was standing rigidly by the service station, his eyes fixed on their table. The waiter's face was pale, his posture tense. Actually, James said, I'd like to discuss that. Would you mind if we included my original server in this conversation? Reynolds looked confused for a moment, then followed James's gaze to Thomas. His expression darkened slightly. Of course. If there was any issue with service, I want to address it immediately. He snapped his fingers and Antonio hurried over. Please ask Thomas to join us, Reynolds instructed. Antonio looked alarmed but nodded. Right away, sir. As Antonio went to fetch Thomas, Reynolds turned back to James. I assure you, if there were any shortcomings in our service, they'll be addressed immediately. We pride ourselves on excellence. I appreciate that, James said. Thomas approached the table slowly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by barely concealed dread. You wanted to see me, Mr. Reynolds? Thomas asked, his voice slightly higher than normal. Yes, Mr. Wilson has some feedback about his dining experience tonight. Reynolds's tone was cool, professional. I'd like you to hear it directly. All 3 men looked at James, who took his time finishing his espresso before speaking. The moment stretched uncomfortably. Thomas, James finally said, when I arrived tonight, what was your first impression of me? The waiter swallowed hard, glancing between James and his boss. I'm not sure what you mean, sir. I think you do, James said gently. When you first approached my table before you knew who I was, what did you think? Thomas's shoulders slumped slightly. He looked down at his polished shoes, then back up, meeting James's gaze. I made assumptions, incorrect ones. Reynolds shifted in his seat, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Wilson, if Thomas was in any way inappropriate, please. James held up a hand. I'd like to hear from Thomas. Thomas took a deep breath. When you first came in, I didn't think you belonged here. You weren't dressed like our usual clientele, and you were alone, and... He trailed off, clearly struggling to find the right words. And I'm black, James finished for him, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. Thomas flinched slightly but nodded. Yes, I made judgments based on your appearance that were unprofessional and wrong. I treated you differently than I would have treated other guests, and there's no excuse for that. Reynolds's face had gone from uncomfortable to mortified. I assure you, Mr. Wilson, this is not how we train our staff. This is completely unacceptable behavior and, Mr. Reynolds, James interrupted again, I'm not looking for anyone to be punished. That's not why I brought this up. Reynolds fell silent, confusion evident on his face. James turned his attention back to Thomas. Do you know why I noticed the difference in how you treated me? Thomas shook his head. Because it happens all the time, James said simply, in stores and hotels and restaurants like this one. I've achieved a certain level of success in life, but I still walk into places and see that moment of assessment, that quick calculation of whether I belong. The restaurant around them had grown quieter as nearby diners sensed the seriousness of the conversation. The difference tonight, James continued, is that halfway through my meal the calculation changed. Once you realized who I was, the treatment changed. And that's actually more troubling than the initial judgment. Thomas looked confused. More troubling? I don't understand. Because it suggests that respect should be based on status or wealth, James explained. That people only deserve courtesy if they have the right job title or bank balance. Reynolds cleared his throat. Mr. Wilson, while I completely agree with your sentiments, I want to assure you that this is an isolated incident. Our establishment welcomes everyone. With all due respect, Mr. Reynolds, James said, I don't think it is isolated. I think it's systemic, not just in your restaurant, but in our society. The question is, what are we going to do about it? A heavy silence fell over the table. Thomas looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. Reynolds was clearly calculating the potential PR disaster unfolding at table 15, and James sat calmly, waiting for a response. Finally, Thomas spoke up. You're right, he said quietly. And I'm truly sorry. Not just because you turned out to be someone important, but because no one should be treated the way I treated you. It was wrong. The sincerity in his voice seemed genuine. James nodded, acknowledging the apology. So what happens now? Reynolds asked, his businessman's instincts clearly trying to find a way to salvage the situation. James leaned back in his chair. That depends on what you both want to happen. I'm not interested in public apologies or empty gestures. I'm interested in real change. Reynolds nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. What did you have in mind? I have some ideas, James said. But first, I'd like to hear yours. What do you think needs to change, Mr. Reynolds? And Thomas, what have you learned from this that could make a difference going forward? Thomas looked surprised to be included in the solution. He took a moment to gather his thoughts. I think we need training, but not just the kind where someone lectures us about treating everyone equally. We need to understand why these biases exist in the first place and how they affect people's daily lives. He glanced at James. Until tonight, I didn't realize how automatic my judgments were. I didn't even question them. Reynolds nodded, seeming to recognize the value in Thomas's words. We could implement a more comprehensive training program across all our restaurants, not just for new hires, but for everyone, including management. He looked at James. Would you be willing to help us develop something like that? James hadn't expected this turn in the conversation. He'd been prepared for defensiveness, perhaps even anger. This openness to change was refreshing. I might be, he said. My foundation has done some work in this area. We could certainly share resources. Reynolds' eyes lit up. Your foundation? I wasn't aware. The Wilson Equal Opportunity Foundation, James said. We focus on creating pathways to success for underrepresented groups, particularly in technology and business. That's exactly the kind of expertise we need, Reynolds said, now leaning forward eagerly. Perhaps there's a partnership opportunity here that goes beyond just our restaurant group. As they continued talking, James noticed the tension in Thomas's shoulders had eased somewhat. The waiter was listening intently to the conversation, occasionally nodding as points were made about inclusivity and unconscious bias. Around them, the restaurant had returned to its normal hum of conversation and clinking glasses. Most diners were unaware of the significant discussion happening at table 15, a discussion that might eventually affect how they themselves were treated when they walked through these doors. By the time the conversation wound down, James's espresso cup was empty and Reynolds' scotch was gone. What had started as a confrontation had evolved into something more constructive. It wasn't a complete resolution. Those rarely happened in real life. But it was a beginning. As Reynolds stood to leave, he extended his hand to James once more. Thank you for your honesty tonight, Mr. Wilson. I believe something important has started here. James shook his hand. I hope so. Thomas, who had remained standing throughout the conversation, gave James a small nod of respect before following Reynolds away from the table. As James signaled for the check, he reflected on how differently the evening had turned out from what he'd expected. Sometimes, The most meaningful changes started with uncomfortable conversations. Tonight had certainly been one of those. 2 weeks had passed since that evening at Bella Vista. James sat in his office on the 32nd floor of the Wilson Technologies building, looking out at the city skyline. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view, but his mind was elsewhere. His assistant, Luis, knocked lightly on the open door. "Mr. Wilson, your 2 o'clock is here." James turned from the window and smiled. "Thanks, Luis. Send them in." Luis nodded and stepped aside, allowing David Reynolds and Thomas Mitchell to enter the office. Reynolds looked confident in another expensive suit, though slightly less at ease in this environment than he had been in his own restaurant. Thomas, by contrast, looked completely out of place, his eyes widening as he took in the modern office with its sleek furnishings and impressive artwork. "Mr. Reynolds." "Thomas," James greeted them, standing and walking around his desk to shake their hands. "Thank you for coming." "Please call me David," Reynolds said. "And thank you for making time for us. I know how busy you must be." James gestured toward the seating area near the windows, a comfortable arrangement of chairs around a low table, more like a living room than a traditional meeting space. "Have a seat," he offered. "Can I get you anything?" "Water, coffee?" "Water would be fine," Reynolds said. Thomas nodded in agreement, still taking in his surroundings. James pressed a button on his desk. "Luis, could we get some water, please?" As they settled into the chairs, an awkward silence fell over the group. Thomas fidgeted with his tie, clearly uncomfortable. "I have to admit," James said, breaking the tension, "I wasn't sure you'd follow up after our conversation." Reynolds smiled tightly. "I'm a man of my word, Mr. Wilson, and I meant what I said about wanting to address the issues we discussed." Luis returned with a tray of water glasses and set them on the table before quietly leaving the office, closing the door behind him. "So," James said once they were alone, "tell me what you've been thinking since our dinner." Reynolds glanced at Thomas, then back to James. "Well, as I mentioned in my email, we've been doing some soul-searching. After our conversation, I spent the next few days observing interactions in all of my restaurants. I saw patterns I hadn't noticed before." "What kind of patterns?" James asked, taking a sip of water. "Exactly what you described. Different treatment based on appearances. Nothing as obvious as refusing service, but subtle things. Where people were seated, how quickly they were served, the language staff used." Reynolds shook his head. "I've been in this business for 30 years. I should have seen it." Thomas cleared his throat. "If I may," he began hesitantly. James nodded encouragingly. "Please." "After that night, I started paying attention to how I interact with guests. I realized I've been making snap judgments for years without even thinking about it." Thomas looked down at his hands. "It's uncomfortable to admit, but it's the truth." James appreciated the honesty. "Recognition is the first step," he said. "But what happens next is what really matters." Reynolds sat forward, suddenly animated. "That's exactly why we're here. I've been researching training programs, but nothing seems comprehensive enough. Most are just checkbox exercises that don't create real change." He paused. "I was hoping your foundation might have resources or expertise we could draw on." James had anticipated this request. He'd spent the past 2 weeks consulting with his foundation team about what an effective intervention might look like for Reynolds' restaurant group. "We do have some ideas," James said, "but before we get into that, I'd like to hear from Thomas. You're on the front lines of this issue. What do you think would make a difference?" Thomas looked surprised to be asked his opinion. He took a moment to gather his thoughts. "Well, I've been thinking about this a lot," he said slowly. "I think part of the problem is that we live in different worlds. I grew up in a neighborhood where everyone looked like me. I went to school with people who looked like me. Even now, most of my friends look like me." He glanced at Reynolds. "No offense, Mr. Reynolds." "None taken," Reynolds replied. "I think what I'm trying to say," Thomas continued, "is that it's easy to make assumptions about people who seem different from you when you don't really know any people like them." He looked at James. "Until our conversation, I had never had someone point out my behavior like that. No one had ever made me think about it." James nodded. "That's a really important insight, Thomas. Exposure and meaningful conversation are powerful tools for change." "Exactly," Thomas said, gaining confidence. "I think if there was a way for staff to hear stories like yours, not just statistics or rules, but real experiences from real people, it might help them see things differently." Reynolds was nodding along. I like that approach. Stories have power. They stay with you in a way that policy manuals don't. James smiled. This was exactly the kind of thinking he'd hoped to hear. As it happens, my foundation has been developing a program that works along those lines. We call it shared experiences. It brings together people from different backgrounds to share their stories in a structured environment. That sounds promising, Reynolds said. How does it work? It's a series of sessions over several months, James explained. It combines personal storytelling with education about systemic issues and practical tools for changing behaviors. It's not a quick fix. Real change takes time, but we've seen promising results in other industries. Thomas was listening intently. Would I be able to participate in something like that? Absolutely, James said. In fact, if we move forward with this, you could be one of the program facilitators. Your perspective would be valuable. Thomas looked surprised. Me, a facilitator? Why not? James asked. You've already shown the ability to reflect on your own behavior and recognize the need for change. That's a crucial first step. Reynolds was watching this exchange with interest. How would we implement this across all our restaurants? We have over 20 locations and hundreds of staff members. We'd start with one location, Bella Vista perhaps, and train a core group who could then help expand the program. James explained. It's important to build slowly and get it right rather than rushing to scale. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. And what would your foundation's involvement be? We'd provide the curriculum, train the initial facilitators, and offer ongoing support, James said. But for this to work, it needs to become part of your organization's culture, not something imposed from outside. And the cost? Reynolds asked, ever the businessman. James smiled. That's something we should discuss, but I'm less interested in a fee than in a commitment. If we do this, I want to know that you're in it for the long haul, not just looking for a quick PR win. Reynolds held James's gaze for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't serious about making changes. He glanced at Thomas. What happened that night was a wake-up call. I don't want my restaurants to be places where anyone feels unwelcome or disrespected. Thomas spoke up again. Mr. Wilson, can I ask you something? Of course. Why are you doing this? After the way you were treated, you could have gone public, filed a complaint, even sued the restaurant. Instead, you're trying to help us. Why? It was a good question, and James took a moment to consider his answer. Because outrage is easy, he finally said. Anyone can point out a problem and walk away. It's much harder to stay and work toward a solution, and ultimately, that's what creates real change. He looked between Reynolds and Thomas. I could have embarrassed you both publicly, but what would that accomplish? A moment of shame, maybe some defensive apologies, and then everything goes back to the way it was. Reynolds nodded slowly. I appreciate that perspective. It would have been easier for you to walk away. I've spent my life building things, James said. My company, my foundation, they're about creating something positive. This feels like an opportunity to build something meaningful with you both. The three men fell silent for a moment, each contemplating what lay ahead. The city skyline provided a dramatic backdrop through the windows, a reminder of the world beyond this office where their work would eventually make an impact. Finally, Reynolds spoke. So what's our next step? James reached for a folder on the table beside him. I've outlined a preliminary plan here. Take it home, read through it, and let me know your thoughts. If you're still interested, we can set up a meeting with my foundation team to get started. As Reynolds took the folder, his phone buzzed. He checked it quickly and frowned. I'm sorry, but I have an issue at one of the restaurants that needs my attention. Would you mind if we continue this conversation another time? Not at all, James said, standing. Take your time with the materials. This isn't a decision to rush. Reynolds shook James's hand firmly. Thank you for your time and your willingness to work with us. I'll be in touch soon. As Reynolds headed for the door, Thomas hesitated. Mr. Wilson, could I have just another minute of your time? Reynolds paused at the door. I can wait downstairs if you need a ride back, Thomas. That would be great. Thank you, Thomas said. Once Reynolds had left, Thomas turned back to James. I just wanted to say something to you privately. Go ahead, James said, gesturing for Thomas to sit again. Thomas remained standing. That night at the restaurant, it changed something in me. I've been a waiter for 12 years, and I've never really thought about how I treat people, how I judge them without even realizing it. He paused, searching for the right words. I just wanted to thank you for not giving up on me, for seeing that I could be better. James was touched by the sincerity in Thomas's voice. We all have blind spots, Thomas. The important thing is what we do once we see them. Thomas nodded. I won't forget that lesson. Whatever happens with Mr. Reynolds and the restaurant group, I wanted you to know that you've already made a difference with me. As James watched Thomas leave, he felt a sense of cautious optimism. One conversation wouldn't change the world, but it could be the beginning of something important. And sometimes that was enough. 6 months later, James pulled up to Bella Vista in his Tesla. The valet, a young man with a bright smile, opened his door. Good evening, sir. Welcome to Bella Vista. Thank you, James said, handing over his keys. I have a reservation for 7:30. Of course. Mr. Wilson, they're expecting you. James smiled at the recognition but noticed something different. There was no surprise in the valet's eyes, no sudden shift in manner upon realizing who he was. Just genuine, consistent courtesy. As James walked through the restaurant's entrance, he noted other subtle changes. The doorman greeted a couple in casual attire with the same warmth he showed to guests in formal wear. At the hostess stand, an elderly woman was being helped to her table with attentive care. Despite not looking like the typical Bella Vista clientele, the hostess smiled when she saw James. Mr. Wilson, welcome back. Your table is ready. Would you like to be seated now, or would you prefer to wait for the rest of your party in the bar? I'll wait at the table, thank you, James replied. The hostess led him through the restaurant, not to a corner by the kitchen, but to a prime table with an excellent view of both the city lights and the pianist. James noted that the restaurant was even more beautiful than he remembered, with fresh flowers on every table and subtle lighting that created a warm glow throughout the space. Your server will be with you shortly, the hostess said as she handed him a menu. Enjoy your evening. James had just started looking at the wine list when a familiar voice spoke. Good evening, Mr. Wilson. It's good to see you again. James looked up to see Thomas standing by his table, dressed in a crisp uniform with a new pin on his lapel that read, Senior Server and Training Liaison. Thomas, James said warmly. You're looking well. Thank you, sir. I feel well. Thomas seemed more confident than before, standing taller with a genuine smile. Can I get you something to drink while you wait for your guests? Just sparkling water for now, thanks. We'll order wine when everyone arrives. Of course. Thomas placed a linen napkin on the table. I wanted to thank you again for everything. The past 6 months have been transformative. James nodded. I've heard good things from David. He says the program is going well. Better than we expected, Thomas agreed. We've had our challenges, but people are really engaging with the material. He glanced around the restaurant. Have you noticed any differences since your last visit? Several, James said. The atmosphere feels more welcoming. And I noticed the staff seems more diverse. Thomas nodded. That's been a priority. Mr. Reynolds realized our staff didn't reflect our customer base or the city we serve. He paused. I'm actually helping with the hiring process now. That's impressive, James said sincerely. Congratulations on the promotion. Thomas looked pleased. It's been a journey. I'll get your water and give you a moment with the menu. As Thomas walked away, James reflected on the changes that had occurred since that fateful dinner. After their meeting in his office, Reynolds had fully committed to the Shared Experiences program. What started as a pilot at Bella Vista had expanded to all 23 restaurants in the Reynolds group. James was lost in thought when he heard someone call his name. He looked up to see Reynolds approaching his table, followed by a diverse group of people, the foundation team and restaurant staff who had been working together on the program. James, Reynolds said, extending his hand. Sorry we're running a few minutes late. Traffic was terrible. No problem at all, James replied, standing to greet everyone. I just arrived myself. Introductions were made as everyone took their seats. The group included Reynolds, Patricia Chen, the head of HR for the restaurant group, Darius Jackson from James's foundation, and 2 other Bella Vista staff members who had become program facilitators alongside Thomas. Once they were settled and drinks were ordered, Reynolds raised his water glass. Before we get to dinner, I'd like to propose a toast. To James, without whom none of this would have happened. Everyone raised their glasses, but James shook his head modestly. The credit goes to all of you. You've done the hard work, me perhaps, Reynolds conceded. But you gave us the push we needed. And the tools to make real change, Patricia spoke up. The numbers speak for themselves. Customer satisfaction is up 22% across all locations. Staff retention has improved by 15%. And the diversity of both our staff and our customer base has increased significantly. Numbers are good, James acknowledged. But what about the less tangible changes? That's what I'm most interested in hearing about. Thomas, who had returned with a tray of drinks, set them down carefully. May I? He asked Reynolds, who nodded encouragingly. The biggest change I've seen is in how we talk to each other, Thomas said. Before, there were things we just didn't discuss. Assumptions we made, jokes we laughed at, comments we ignored. Now there's an openness that wasn't there before. Darius nodded. That's consistent with what we've observed in the feedback sessions. People are more comfortable having uncomfortable conversations. One of the other servers, a woman named Lucia, added, For me, the most powerful part was hearing everyone's stories. We had a regular customer, an older black woman who comes in every Sunday for brunch. She shared how she's been followed in stores her whole life, how people still sometimes mistake her for staff instead of a customer. It hit home for a lot of us. Reynolds, who had been listening intently, said, We still have a long way to go. This isn't something that gets fixed in 6 months, but we're committed to continuing the work. The conversation flowed naturally through dinner, with everyone sharing insights and challenges from the program. James was impressed by the genuine engagement he saw. This wasn't just lip service or a PR exercise. Real changes were happening both in policies and in hearts and minds. As they finished their main courses, Reynolds signaled for Thomas. Could you ask Chef Paolo to join us for a moment? Thomas nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, he returned with a distinguished-looking man in chef's whites. Mr. Wilson, Reynolds said, I'd like you to meet Chef Paolo Rossi, the culinary genius behind Bella Vista. Chef, this is James Wilson. The chef shook James's hand warmly. It's an honor to finally meet you, Mr. Wilson. I've heard so much about you. The honor is mine, James replied. Your food is exceptional, Chef Paolo beamed. Thank you. I wanted to personally invite you to a special event we're hosting next month. We're launching a mentorship program for young chefs from underserved communities. James raised his eyebrows, looking at Reynolds. It was inspired by our work with your foundation, Reynolds explained. We realized we could do more than just change our hiring practices. We could actively create opportunities for talented, young people who might not otherwise have access to this industry. 10 students will work, alongside our staff, learning every aspect of the restaurant business. Chef Paolo continued enthusiastically. Not just cooking, but management, service, wine, everything. And we're providing scholarships for culinary school. James was genuinely impressed. That's remarkable. What inspired this specific initiative? Reynolds and Chef Paolo exchanged glances. Actually, Reynolds said, it was Thomas's idea. Thomas, who had been quietly attending to their table, looked slightly embarrassed at being the center of attention. I grew up in a neighborhood where being a chef at a place like this seemed impossible, Thomas explained. Not because we didn't have talent or drive, but because we didn't have connections or opportunities. I thought about how different my life might have been if someone had opened that door earlier. James nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly the kind of systemic change that creates lasting impact. I'd be honored to attend the launch. As the evening wound down and desserts were savored, James found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. What had started as an unpleasant dining experience had blossomed into something meaningful and far-reaching. After saying goodbye to the group, James lingered at the table, finishing his coffee. Thomas approached with the check. I hope everything was to your satisfaction tonight, Mr. Wilson. More than satisfactory, James assured him. It's been a remarkable evening. Thomas seemed to hesitate, then said, There's something I've been meaning to ask you. Why did you come back? After the way you were treated that first night, most people would never have returned. James considered the question. I believe in second chances, he said finally, and in people's capacity to grow. That night could have ended very differently, with anger and defensiveness on all sides. Instead, it became an opportunity for reflection and change. Thomas nodded slowly. I think about that night often, how differently things might have gone if you'd reacted the way most people would have. We all have choices in how we respond to situations, James said. Sometimes the harder path leads to better outcomes. As James left the restaurant, he paused on the sidewalk to look back at Bella Vista. The restaurant was beautiful, filled with happy diners and attentive staff. But now it was something more, a place